It's called the Semantic Web because I don't actually know very much about Semantic Web, and I don't do anything with it. I think what I do has to do with English literature and making texts play better with each other. That fits very broadly speaking into the Semantic Web. But what I have to tell you, what I'm going to talk about is actually very, very narrow and very discipline specific, and some of the general points have to do with how difficult it is to get things done. That's why the title of my talk is Lost in Translation. I'm not sure how many of you saw that movie of some years ago in which actually nothing happens. What was lost in translation. And in fact, the final message comes through that this aging man and this young woman probably do not want to have a relationship. So that kind of gets through. They have a relationship, there's not a relationship. Anyhow, I'm a professor of English, and I'm a classicist by training, and I'm a very old-fashioned philologist, and I am actually deeply skeptical about much that is going on in the world around us that is driven by technology. My wife and I are both fond of the 17th century philosopher and mathematician Pascal, and Pascal writes about divertissement, or diversion, and all problems in the world are due to the fact that people cannot sit still. Now we Twitter. So Jean comes home and talks about the fact that she works for an educational institution, that now there is this great concern that more and more people have more and more trouble focusing on this. And is there a relationship between the technology, or is it that people have always been gossipy, that people have never sat still, that wherever they're, the number of people who want to focus on something is always a very small percentage. One of the greatest computer programmers, actually, I think to this day, if he's still alive, doesn't have email or doesn't do email, doesn't do anything, Donald Knuth. He wrote about algorithms in his probably some cottage somewhere. Now, lost in translation. I'm currently involved in a project that is called MONK. And MONK stands for Metadata of a New Knowledge. And it is a project that takes, that has as its vision moving a lot of literature into one document space. And it's called MONK. There is a deliberately theological reference there, and that is the origin of the modern database and the origin of many kind of desires that are associated with the web have to go back to the 13th century. There were these monks, and these monks read a book that mattered a lot to them. It was the Bible. It mattered because the Bible has the word of the Lord in it. If you believe he's up there, and if you believe that what you have in front of you is what he says, it really matters a lot to figure out what is there. Because if you get it wrong, you might end up in hell. So you have a very strong incentive to figure out what it means. But so much of it is so difficult. It is such a long book. I have a very bad memory. This passage, what does it mean? Well, somewhere there is a passage that is like it. But where? Where is it? I turn the pages of my codex. It takes a long time Now notice we're in the 12th century. We're not in the 16th century in the post-Luther Bible where you have the standard Bible that is divided into chapter and verse, and where there is a middle column, and for any verse there are all kinds of cross-references. You're familiar with that. We're way before that. We're in a world in which there is Matthew and Isaiah. There may even be Isaiah 53. There is certainly not Isaiah 53:1, etc. And so one monk says, well, what if we made a list of all the words in the Bible? And then when we have that list of all the words in the Bible, then we have their places. And once we have this list with the places, then I can look it up. So you have an extraordinarily mechanical procedure. Let's take the words in this text, let's make a list, an inventory of its parts, and let's say where each part is. And somebody might say, what a crude and mechanical procedure, which indeed it is. On the other hand, what motivates it is, well, this word occurs here, that word occurs there. I don't know, I didn't even know it occurred there to look it up, but now I find it. It's the Bible, the Word of God. Therefore, if I don't know whether there's a connection between this here and over that there, he must have had a connection in mind, because there wouldn't be, on the assumption that governs the reading of the Bible, everything is connected to everything. So now, and you call the thing that the monks made, but perfected a little bit, is called a concordance. It's called a concordance because in Augustine, the Church Father Augustine's view of biblical interpretation, the Lord can be ingenious, he can be subtle, but he never deceives, and he always loves. So therefore, every word in the Bible must harmonize with every other word in the Bible in such a way that the overall meaning is love. You translate it into business, and you look for all the connections between the data so that the overriding meaning is profit. So, there is faith, hope, and charity, but the greatest of these is charity, and you can find out your business trinity, but if at the top of it is profit. But you can kind of see, this is a very, the biblical concordance is the first search tool. And it's kind of interesting when you go, I was in Berlin recently, and there was a wonderful exhibit of early print culture, and I looked at Bibles from the 1500s. And you see, all of a sudden, in the middle of the 15th century, you see quite mechanical segmentations. The Bible is divided into chapter and verse. And now that you have chapter and verse, you have segmented the Bible in such a way that every part of it can relate it to every other part. And you say John 3:14 or Luke 2:1 or whatever. Those are metadata. And the metadata create a textual universe that supports interpretation. And so we don't live in a universe like the monks did, in which everybody believed in the Lord, nor do we necessarily believe that the meanings of different texts or the meanings of even of a single text all cohere. In fact, if you know anything about English departments, you are likely to say, no, instead of a hermeneutics of charity, we now have a hermeneutics of suspicion. So hermeneutics of charity would be a hermeneutics in which you say, find the meaning of this poem which resonates most fully in its complexity with some positive message. And the hermeneutics of suspicion is find the meaning in which every act and every agent has the worst possible motive attached to it. And when you have found that, then you have found the true meaning of the poem. Yeah. And at that point, you see that the hermeneutics of charity and the hermeneutics of suspicion are simply reverse coins of each, flip sides of the same coin. If you believe too much, or if you believe too much, or if you believe too little, you are in both cases in some universe of false belief, believing in the wrong way. Anyhow, we may be in a more probabilistic universe in which some things are related to some other things, and it is helpful to catch those echoes, those patterns. And that was probably the guiding assumption behind the Monk project. Now, I'll talk a bit more about it a little later. The particular scholarly world I inhabit is a world of, well, now let me put this a little differently. Somebody at the panel discussion said, is it code or culture? That it's always a culture. If in the world of texts or primary sources for scholarship, the really big division is, are there IP restrictions attached to it, or are there not? If there are IP restrictions, intellectual property restrictions attached to it, my ability to work with those data is severely constrained in many ways. If you have text, if you have documents, I use document here as something that might be a text, but whatever, any object of inquiry, if it has no IP restrictions attached to it, I can do anything with it that I like. I can, whatever. If there are IP restrictions, I can't. The magic date, therefore, is 1923. For most practical purposes, all texts published before 1923, not quite true, but it's true enough. All texts before 1923 are out of copyright. All texts after 1923 are in copyright. The odds of 1933 moving forward are very slim as long as the Disney Corporation wants to protect Mickey Mouse. So Mickey Mouse is, for many, from a scholar's perspective, Mickey Mouse is a real devil. Now, it turns out I teach at Northwestern University. I know a lot about its English department. I was its chair for some years. And I know something about the English department at the University of Chicago. Turns out that half the people who do research at Northwestern and at the University of Chicago deal for the most part, not always, but deal for the most part with texts written before 1923. The others deal with the world after then. As we move forward in time, the number of people who work, whose work concentrates on the world before 1923, the number may not go down, but the percentage will go down. But you can say that, you can make a reasonable prediction that for the next quarter century, scholarship that has as its primary object texts in English written before 1923 will occupy a substantial attention of the Academy. What will happen after that, I don't know. Maybe everything before the year 2000 will be in some fog, some Paleolithic fog. I remember my son, who's now almost 40, when he was 14, that would have been in the 80s. He said, "Daddy, who was Ho Chi Minh?" And but the main point here is that there is a very large body of textual data that are in principle free of intellectual property constraints, and that in principle you could move into a document space where you could use the power of the computer to trace certain patterns. Now think for a moment about the way you walk into a library. The library is actually a very highly organized structure. You can perform that experiment by undoing a library. You pull all the books from the shelves, you throw them at random cross, and you destroy the catalog, and you say, go, practice serendipity. Isn't it nice to have all those books lying there on the floor? Any book might lie next to any other book, and serendipity, browsing. Wouldn't it be great? Well, it wouldn't. So you want a little more. If you pick up one book, and you pick up another book, you are a human reader, and if you think of yourself as a computer for a moment, you have a processing environment, processing capabilities that are relatively slow, but within those constraints, extraordinarily flexible. Whether the text is written in capital letters or lowercase letters, you can manage it. If you read HTE instead of THE, you don't even see it. You automatically correct it to the. If it's in Gothic, you accommodate it. If you look at a page and it says 27 up on the right-hand corner, you know that isn't part of the text. That's a kind of metadata. If there's a running head at the top of the page in capitals, you notice that's not part of the text, that's a running head. If it's in lowercase, you also notice it because you notice, oh, if it's kind of set off a little bit and not flows into the text. Yeah. You do all this. So the human reader is, in a metaphor, sort of a very slow all-terrain vehicle, a terrific walker. You know, you manipulate, you can walk where a car couldn't drive. And if you can walk where a car couldn't drive, that's a great advantage. On the other hand, you can't walk very fast. If you move stuff into a computer environment, well, as some IBM guy said, people are smart but slow, computers are dumb but fast. And so you have how do you take advantage of the things that you can do fast? And now you run into humongous problems. We had, if you want to do very simple searching, stuff in Project Gutenberg is well enough. It does well enough. If you want to do any kind of more complex analysis, things become very difficult. And here's my first point about loss in translation. We worked with a bunch of programmers who came out of the information retrieval world, and we could never get together. They had this concept of stop words. Now I remember reading somewhere, stop words are not a feature, they are a bug. You know what stop words are, right? I mean, the 120 most common words in the language that are often filtered out because they provide the syntactic glue but tell you relatively little about the direct meaning of a word. If you're into information extraction, throwing away stop words makes perfect sense, unless you want to find the Johns Hopkins University, but the is actually part of the name. If you're into textual analysis, if you're in any kind of stylistic analysis, stop words are absolutely essential, because the difference between one text and another may have a lot more to do with the relative frequency of the proportion of subordinating conjunctions to ordinary conjunctions, a paratactic style versus a hypotactic style. So these are not things you want to throw away. Could never persuade the information retrieval guys that stop words matter. They always wanted to throw them away. The other day I talked with a colleague from the University of Wisconsin, and I said something like that to him. I said, I thought that the most important professional opportunity or change in the discipline of literary studies might be the application of techniques developed in corpus linguistics to literary studies. And he said yes. And then I said that I had trouble with these, with the information retrieval guys. And he said, yeah, they just want to go for the shortest vector. And if you know anything about English departments, people in English departments don't want to go for the shortest vector. The only interest they have in the shortest vector is to figure out whether it tells them something about the longest possible route. That's the kind of people we are. And if you're just interested in the shortest vector, forget it. So we have this project in which we wanted to move texts together so that you could find out all manner of things about them. It helps to have XML. XML does, for instance, it divides the chapters of a book into different chapters. If you're doing Bleak House, for instance, Bleak House is a novel in which you have alternating chapter types. There are chapters in which the narrator speaks, and there are chapters in which a central character speaks in the first person, Esther. There's Esther's story and there is Dickens' story. If you want to do any kind of analysis on it, you might say, well, does Esther talk differently from Dickens? And if you do this, you can't do this with a plain text of Bleak House, because the plain text of Bleak House, you couldn't tell the Esther chapters apart from the Dickens chapters. If you have something very primitive, you have the text all wrapped into, each chapter is a div, an XML div or division, then you can, in 10 minutes, go through and mark the Dickens chapters as div type equals Dickens, and the other one div type equals Esther. Then now you can look for, that took you 10 minutes if you have a basic XML. Now you can compare the Dickens chapter with the Esther chapter, at which point you discover that the narrative, we may have noticed this before, that the narrative of Dickens is always uses the present tense. Esther always uses the past tense, and then you have an opposition between two different forms of narration, in which the narrator in Dickens is always on the move, and Esther is more reflective. Well, so we brought together a lot of texts. We have 2,500 different texts in our monk project, and these came from different library projects. The University of Virginia, the University of Michigan, and Indiana University have been very active in coding texts, and they had something they call the Level 4 guidelines. The Level 4 guidelines were guidelines to ensure consistent encoding of text, just like XML is an encoding structure that in theory is supposed to make it easier to move things, make text machine actionable as opposed to readable. It turned out that every project had its own way of doing things which drove the programmers nuts. For instance, such primitive things as end of line hyphenation. How do you treat it? This matters as soon as you want to tokenize texts. And in the texts that were done in the 80s, in the 90s, before Unicode, if you have a hyphen, well, you don't necessarily know, especially if nobody has, in the transcription, observed the line break. You don't know whether it's a hyphenated word, and a real hyphenated word, or whether it's a word with a soft hyphen. So you need to do all kinds of programming to get. And the lesson of that was that that there's a whole decade of text encoding where every project had made intelligent choices about how they wanted to do it for their purposes, and nobody had paid any attention to the question, what if somebody else from some other project wants to use my texts and combine them with his texts? It took a very gifted XSLT programmer about 6 months to take texts from 5 or 6 different archives that followed guidelines, or said they followed guidelines, and turn them into texts that would allow mashups, so that you could do that. If something was a chapter here, it was also a chapter there. It's a lot of work. There's another aspect, and this follows on your presentation when you talked about ontologies. Language is extraordinarily slippery. Does the word bank refer to the bank of a river? Does it refer to the financial institution? If you have a particular domain, say if you have a financial ontology, the word riverbank doesn't occur at all. So in many problems of linguistic ambiguity get lost or are resolved if you have ontologies that are in some kind of a silo. If you are in literature, on the other hand, literature is by definition a field that has no subject domain. You might have pharmacists. There's a pharmacist in Madame Bovary. You might have businessmen. There are capitalists and Little Dorrit. There is always love and there's always death. I mean, those two issues. But other than that, literature has no subject domain. So if you wanted to have some kind of verbal taxonomy that works well for literature, that would be very, very, very hard. But there's another problem. We wanted to have a document space in which texts from Chaucer to Joyce, those are roughly the boundaries. I think of Chaucer more as a very early modern writer than as a medieval writer. But between Chaucer and Joyce, there could be an archive of texts that are fully interoperable. But then you have orthographic variants. If you do any kind of text processing that works in the professional world, you have a standardized form of spelling with certain kinds of variances, British spelling versus US spelling. But those are highly, very standardized, and they yield to algorithms. If you deal with texts that are written before 1750 and you go back in time, you're increasingly in a world of great orthographic variance. And the orthographic variance, unfortunately, cannot be captured algorithmically very easily. I did that once. If you take text around 1600, I had an archive of some 600 million words. Those are the text creation partnerships from early English books online. So 600 million words, there's occurrences, word occurrences. There were about 2.5 million spellings. distinct spellings, including many of them that were really weird and they're just plain wrong. But how do you know that? Then I wrote some scripts that try to capture characteristic differences. For instance, if the word university is spelled VNIUERSITIE, you have 3 rules that are spelling rules that are operate with 99 to 100%. Intervocalic V, love, is nearly always a U before 1600. Initial U followed by a consonant is V, so you just reverse those. Word terminal IE is always, in modern spelling, Y. But those cases, there are a lot of them, those cases capture about 15% of the types and maybe 30% of the tokens. The rest, you are in a world of stuff where you actually have to do a certain kind of manual correction. You can make that easier in various ways that I don't want to bore you with. But if you can create virtual orthographic standardization, that is, if you can surround every word with a spelling form that is recognizable to a modern reader, you make searching a lot easier. If you can lemmatize words to a common lemma, a lemma is the form of a word under which it most commonly occurs in a dictionary. It's not stemming. Stemming is a more radical form of linguistic truncation than lemmatization. But if you can refer a word to a lemma, a common spelling, and to a part of speech, and if you can do that consistently from 1400 to the early 20th century, then you have 450 years of written English in which every word becomes algorithmically comparable with any other word. There's a considerable research potential in that. I call that an English diachronic digital annotated corpus, or EDAC. And EDAC would be a great thing to have. Now, how would you get it? That's actually where you probably would want to rely on collaborative labor. It fits into the theme of collaboration. And are there people around in the world who might want to do that? There probably are. I mean, there's a lot of volunteer labor. If you, for instance, you look at Project Gutenberg, and you look at the volunteer transcribing labor that went into that project, it's enormous. On the other hand, if you wanted a digital annotated corpus where you have rich metadata such that at the end every word and every word part is computationally comparable, you need much, much tighter standards than are currently used in Project Gutenberg, similar projects. And you would actually need some kind of web-based data curation format that would make it attractive and easy for people to do the same thing in the same way, so that a retired high school teacher in Arkansas or a dentist in Alabama with literary tastes might want to do that. Here's another example. If you go back and say, what do we know about spoken language? We've had for about 100 years, we have had recordings. We've had human recordings. Widely spread recordings are probably not so old, probably the 20s and 30s. I think probably increases. If you go back into before 1880, you have sporadic phonographic records of one sort or another. But if you go back before then, our only evidence for spoken language is written representations of spoken language. There are some genres in which everything is spoken all the time. Plays are an example. There are other genres in which people are recorded as speaking. Novels. And in fact, if you look at typographic, if you look at novels and you wanted to look at them as objects and say, okay, tell me what kinds of distinctions are clearly expressed, clearly typographically expressed in these books, such that if you read a novel and you never found that distinction, you would be puzzled. And in novels before the 20th century, it's clearly the distinction between spoken language and written language. I mean, the narrator speaks or Emma speaks, or whoever. And you say, well, would it be helpful to have that? If you could, if you had a text archive in which the way in which spoken language is separated out from narrated language, would it be helpful? Yes. It would, for one, tell you a lot about spoken language, though you'd have to be careful there, because one thing we know is that scripts are very, very different from what people actually say. I mean, scripts are much denser than real spoken language. Still, the only thing we have is written representations, and it would be useful to have them. So there is a very interesting collaborative software project to say, could we create a platform that would allow, over time, for all the books that people cherish to be, and that are not subject to IP constraints, to exist in a library that is fully interoperable. And who would pay for that? How would you do it? It's a tough question. But that's been a little bit of a ramble through a particular part of the digital forest. There's a side of me that feels apologetic about it, because I really should talk about much grander things. There's another side that doesn't feel apologetic about it at all, because I think the encounter of every scholar, every teacher with the digital medium is always my specific neighborhood. People don't live in Chicago, people live in neighborhoods, and disciplines live in neighborhoods. And one of the problems that I have with a lot of the digital stuff is that there always is some kind of implied imperative that you should mix everything with everything. So that I once gave a talk about digital textuality, and there was an art historian in the room, and the first thing she asked me, why do you always talk about text? Why don't you talk about pictures? I said, well, I wish I had been less polite. I could have turned it around and said, look, if you gave a talk about this picture and that picture, and I said afterwards, why do you talk about this picture and that picture? Why don't you talk about poems? It said, okay, I'm interested in this, you're interested in that. Is that okay? The answer is yes, it is okay. Would it be better if both of us are interested in the relation between this and that? It might be. On the other hand, that might just be a lot of amateur junk. So a phrase like, for instance, digital humanities is a very dubious phrase because it implies that somehow the technology drives the project, whereas in a saner world, I have my interests, and these interests interact with some technological affordances at some point. Some of these affordances are of no interest to me, others are of passionate interest, and somehow the idea that we should all be interested in the same thing in the same way is not there. But when people get into the things they're interested in, they tend all of a sudden to be interested in very precise things. For instance, if I'm into cars, then I know things about 8-cylinder engines and forms of timing. My parents were contemptuous of my philological interests. They had an interest in oriental carpets, which I had not the slightest interest in. They liked to turn the oriental rugs over and look at the knot count, and I was an obedient German child, so I thought to myself, but I never told them, look, if you think it is a stupid waste of time to count syllables in poems, let me tell you that turning a rug around and counting the knots is just as stupid. Or to turn it around into a positive way and say, when you're interested in something, you really get interested in the details of it, and that is the pleasure of it. And when you have a group of literary scholars, they, of course, are very, very interested in the details of various texts. And then the question is, can we use the technology to make detailed inquiry across large data sets possible? And what does it take to do that?